What you just heard was a little bit of me trying to play a Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers tune by the great Mike Campbell. But I've kind of been going on this deep dive lately into Mike Campbell's tone and his approach. I thought, well, what are things that I could do to kind of stack the deck so that I sound a little bit more like what he's doing? And that's not to say that everything's in the gear, but there are things in the gear that can help us. Now, I've read in interviews where he talks about live, they would use the Vox Super Beetle 100s, and these were huge, powerful amps, and he kind of wondered how Tom Petty was even able to sing over them live because they were so loud. He also talked about using Vox AC30s. But the primary thing that he landed on and is talked about ad nauseum as part of the key element of his tone is the use of two small amplifiers. The Tweed Deluxe and the Fender Princeton, both compact combo amps that have very little wattage comparatively to, say, the AC30 or the Super Beetle. In fact, Mike Campbell mentioned on the first couple of records that he recorded with Tom Petty, as he was kind of moving in to this being his mainstay amp sort of selection, was he was using a 50s Tweed Deluxe and using a Super 6, a silver face version, for all those early Tom Petty records with his broadcaster, the Telecaster that he had for all those classic tones. Eventually, by what I presume to be the mid to later part of the 80s, is when Mike had pretty much gone fully over to the Princeton and Tweed Deluxe combination. And it seems like there were various incarnations that existed. At some point, it was a non-reverb version of a Princeton and a wider panel, or the TV panel version of the Tweed Deluxe, the 5D3 Deluxe. And then into the 90s and more recently, it seems like now he's switched over to the narrow panel, the 57 era Tweed Deluxe and a Princeton Reverb as kind of being the core two amps that he's using, and sometimes will supplement, sometimes with some Voxes and other amplifiers to help fill out the sound. But again, the core elements being these two smaller wattage amps. But let's try it. Let's see what we get. I'm going to run through some songs. I'm going to be using my H150 from Heritage. I'm going to be using a Fender Telecaster Ultra 2. I'm going to be plugged in to my Vertex pedal board. My Vertex pedal board is going to be using just a few pedals to help kind of supplement, just to add slight shades for the right EQ for the song. So in terms of what I'll use on the pedal board, I'll use a little bit of Vertex boost, maybe just to goose the front end of some of the amps a little bit. A little RC booster, just again, give some different EQs, not at the same time, but just depending on what's needed on a song-by-song basis. I'll be using a little delay from a Deluxe Memory Man and a little bit of reverb from the Line 6 M9. Now, in keeping with the sound of Mike Campbell, I'm not running these in stereo, but instead I'm going to use them split mono. On my Vertex buffer interface, if I just plug in the left input to the output buffer section, it will activate the two output buffers for the left and right, so I can feed those and split them to two different amps and keep the signal in mono instead of converting it to stereo. If you're interested in checking that out for the purposes of buffering your rig, I'll put a link in the description. It's a really cool device to have to help manage the impedance and the routing of your entire rig. In addition to the pedal board, we're going to be using my 1966 Princeton Reverb and my 1950s Tweed Deluxe. This is a narrow panel Tweed Deluxe. It's a little bit bastardized. It's got an original chassis. It's got a reproduction cabinet, but we're going to be hearing that Tweed Deluxe with a Celestian Gold, and we're going to be hearing the Princeton with a 10-inch Alessandro speaker made by Eminence. I'm going to start out with doing a little bit of breakdown again, just to kind of recalibrate us in the spirit of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and then we'll move on to some other songs and some other instruments. So breakdown, we heard it before. We knew what we were in for. Let's change guitars. Let's go with the little Telecaster here. And let's hear what we got. I'm going to do a little Bruce Springsteen interpretation of Glory Days and kind of try to play it in the style of Mike Campbell. So that was cool. Got to hear a little telly vibe. I want to stick with that and then move into a little bit of a Sheryl Crow tune that was actually played by the great Wendy Melvoin. It just has a great swing to it. I'm going to try to get that swing back and kind of keep it rootsy. Again, using that perfect Mike Campbell setup. Let's hear a little bit of that. Now, I want to move back to the heritage again for one more song, a tune by Natalie Merchant called Carnival. And it was actually played originally by Jennifer Turner, an amazing guitarist. But kind of want to do it a little bit more rootsy, a little bit more laid back if I can. And just kind of comping the right chords and kind of, again, trying to put some of that Mike Campbell vibe in there and make it feel, rocking, but still rootsy and get some nice double stops in there. I think you're going to dig it. Have a listen. One thing that I find is the complement of these two amplifiers is incredible because you have a really scooped EQ on the black panel Fenders. There's not a lot of mids in that. That's kind of a classic Fender thing. On the Tweed Fenders, however, it is much more mid-range boosted and kind of chimey. And these typically used Alnico speakers, even though I'm not using the original speaker with this. It is still an Alnico speaker as you would have found in the original Jensen. And those tend to distort a little bit prematurely, get some speaker distortion from it. And they tend to add a little bit more top-end sort of fizz. But the balance of the two kind of create this supertone where you have the scooped mids on the black panel Fender, you have the really pronounced mids and jangle of the Tweed, and they're both on the edge of breakup so that when you're digging in, you're getting this really beautiful response from the tubes, and then you back off and you get this really beautiful classic kind of clean tone. I have to say it's probably the most responsive I've felt amplifiers under my fingers, and I'm really using minimal pedals. I really just told you about the pedals that I used as a disclosure to say that it wasn't all the amps. I have to say it's incredible because I usually think of myself as more of a cleaner headroom guy and using distortion pedals and overdrive pedals to get a tone, or using higher headroom amplifiers that have channel switching to get distortion. I almost never think to go this way, but I'm so glad that I was thinking about Mike Campbell and just admiring that tone that I thought, you know what? I have these amps. I can do this. I can really set this up to get this sound. And it is absolutely astonishing. But I know what you might be saying here is like, what the heck, Mason? You got a 60s, mid-60s Princeton. You got a late 50s Tweed Deluxe. Those could cost up to 10 grand to get. And you're absolutely right. And I'm not saying go out and get these amps. But there are a couple of options that you could do that are in the spirit of what this is. So let me tell you a couple of things I thought about. One is that you could just go name brand. You could buy a reissue Princeton, and those are 1,500 new. And I think the Tweed Deluxe, because it's hand wired, is a little bit more, maybe around the $2,000, $2,500 range. But I saw these on Craigslist for half that price. So that's one way to get in if you just wanted to say Fender. Now you could also go the boutique route. You could do it sort of semi Mike Campbell, and you could go the boutique route and get something like a Headstrong Little King Reverb, and those are a couple of grand hand-wired, beautiful amps, and get something like a Victoria 2112, which is a really great recreation of a Tweed Deluxe. And those together might come to around $4,000 new, and then used maybe 30% less than that. You might be able to get it for $25,000 to $3,000. Again, still a lot of money, but I'm just giving you options. Another way to do it would be going with modular pedals. UA makes a beautiful black panel style effect that represents the sound of sort of the mid-60s Fender called the Dream 65. That could be one side. They also make one called the Woodrow, which is, again, designed to be like the sound of a Tweed Fender. Those are, $300 or so each. You get those two, run those as amp sims, run those on each side, and you could even do this via plugins. Now, I can't say that I've tried it to compare how good they are, but we know that plugins have come a long way. Or this could be something if you have a quad Cortex or you got an HX Stomp, you could wire these blocks to be split out and go to those two effects and use those amp effects to simulate the same signal path. However it is that you're going to do it, this is a tone that I think is very usable for a lot of players. I never tried to play like Tom Petty in the Heartbreakers or like Mike Campbell in my entire life. But I plug this in, and it is such a great tone. It is so responsive, and it makes me play in a way that I wouldn't ordinarily play because of the feedback that I'm getting from these amps. And I can really see myself using this as a go-to sound, especially with the Telecaster and the Les Paul style guitars, because they're just so dynamic. It gives me the most out of this instrument that I don't feel like I could get with just pedals into a clean amp. This is something that is incredibly special that I really think that if you try it, you're going to dig it. And as soon as we get done, I'm going to go throw on some Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and just listen to guitars because, man, Mike Campbell is such a badass and absolutely love what he's doing. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Until the next video, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. Go shred, go play some guitar. We'll see you next time.